The rain fell in heavy sheets over the small town of Blackwood, drumming against the stained glass windows of St. Michael's Church. Inside, the air was thick with tension, the scent of damp wood and wilted flowers mixing with the uneasy whispers of the gathered mourners. At the center of it all lay a small white casket, its occupant, a young black girl named Lila Green, barely 16 years old. The priest, Father Donovan, stood rigid behind the pulpit, his knuckles pale as they gripped the edges of the wooden stand. His face was unreadable, but his eyes, dark and stormy, betrayed something deeper. Discomfort? Fear? The congregation shifted in their seats, waiting for him to begin the funeral rites. But instead of prayers, his voice came out cold. Final. "We cannot bury this girl." A gasp rippled through the crowd. Lila's foster mother, Mrs. Green, clutched her husband's arm, her face crumpling in disbelief. "What do you mean?" she cried. "She deserves a proper burial." Father Donovan's jaw tightened. "There are irregularities, things that must be addressed first." No one understood what he meant. Lila had died suddenly. A tragic accident, the authorities had said. A fall from the old bridge near the river. But the way Father Donovan spoke, it was as if he knew something they didn't. As the murmurs grew louder, a frail woman in the back row stood. Miss Edna, the town's oldest librarian, her voice trembling but clear. "Father, the dead must be laid to rest. What could possibly stop you from doing your duty?" The priest's gaze flickered, just for a second, to the casket. Then without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving the church in the stunned silence. Outside, the storm raged on, and hidden beneath Lila's pillow, untouched by the priest's hands, was a sealed envelope. The last words she ever wrote. The Green household was cloaked in grief, the air heavy with the scent of burning candles and the muffled sobs of Lila's foster parents. Mrs. Green sat at the kitchen table, her fingers trembling as they traced the edges of a faded photograph. Lila, smiling brightly on her first day of school, her dark curls bouncing with every step. How could she be gone? And why had Father Donovan refused to bury her? The question gnawed at her like a relentless hunger. Across the room, Mr. Green paced, his boots scuffing against the worn wooden floor. "There's something he's not telling us," he muttered, his voice rough with exhaustion. "Priests don't just refuse burials without reason." The police had ruled Lila's death an accident, but the way Father Donovan had looked at her casket, like it held something unspeakable, left them unsettled. It was then that Miss Edna arrived, her old shawl damp from the rain, her wrinkled hands clutching a small leather-bound book. "I found this in the church," she whispered, pressing it into Mrs. Green's hands. It was hidden beneath the pew where Lila used to sit. The book fell open to a folded letter, the edges slightly yellowed, the ink smudged in places where tears had once fallen. Mrs. Green's breath caught as she recognized Lila's handwriting. Looping, delicate, the way she had always written her name in the margins of her school books. The letter was addressed to no one, yet to everyone. "If you're reading this, it means I'm gone. And if I'm gone, then Father Donovan knows the truth." The words sent a chill down Mrs. Green's spine. What truth? What had Lila known? Before she could read further, a sharp knock echoed through the house. Mr. Green opened the door to find the town's doctor, his face grim. "I need to speak with you," he said, his voice low, "about Lila's body." Mrs. Green's hands shook as she clutched the letter tighter. Whatever secrets Lila had carried to her grave, they were about to unravel. The doctor's words hung in the air like a suffocating fog, his voice barely above a whisper as he revealed what the autopsy had uncovered. Lila hadn't died from the fall. There were no broken bones, no signs of drowning. Instead, her body bore faint marks around her wrists, thin and precise, as if she had been restrained. And then there was the poison, a slow-acting toxin that had quietly stolen her breath away in the hours before she was found near the river. The revelation struck the Greens like a physical blow, their grief twisting into something darker, sharper. How had no one seen it? How had they missed the signs? Mrs. Green's fingers tightened around Lila's letter, the paper crinkling under her grip. The girl had known. She had known she was in danger. The words on the page now burned with urgency, each sentence a piece of a puzzle they were only beginning to understand. Father Donovan knows the truth, Lila had written, but he will never say it, not unless the letter is read where everyone can hear it. The meaning was clear. She wanted her words spoken aloud, in the very church where the priest had refused to lay her to rest. Mr. Green's face hardened with resolve. "We're taking this to the congregation," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "If Lila wanted the truth known, then we won't let her down." But Miss Edna hesitated, her aged eyes flickering with unease. "Father Donovan isn't just hiding something," she murmured. "He's afraid of it, and a man afraid of the past is a man who might do anything to keep it buried." The warning lingered, unspoken but understood. This wasn't just about uncovering secrets. It was about confronting a man who had already proven he would go to great lengths to keep them hidden. As the storm outside rattled the windows, the Greens made their decision. They would return to the church, they would read the letter, and they would demand answers, no matter the cost. The church was colder than they remembered, the scent of incense and old wood now laced with something heavier. Dread. The pews were empty this time, the stained glass saints casting fractured shadows across the floor, where Lila's casket still sat, untouched. Mrs. Green's breath came in shallow bursts as she clutched the letter, her footsteps echoing too loudly in the hollow silence. She had expected resistance, perhaps even fury, but the way Father Donovan stood motionless at the altar, his back turned to them, was worse. He didn't move, didn't speak, as if he had been waiting for this moment and dreaded it in equal measure. Mr. Green was the one who broke the silence. "We know she didn't die by accident," he said, his voice cutting through the stillness like a blade. "And we know you're hiding something." The priest's shoulders tensed, but he didn't turn. Mrs. Green stepped forward then, her hands trembling not from fear, but from a grief so vast it threatened to swallow her whole. "This letter," she said, holding it up like an accusation, "says you know the truth, and I won't let my daughter be buried without it." For the first time, Father Donovan turned to face them. His face was ashen, his eyes hollow, as if he hadn't slept in days. "You don't understand what you're asking," he whispered, but Mrs. Green had already unfolded the letter, her voice steady despite the tears that blurred her vision. She began to read. Lila's words filled the church, soft at first, then gaining strength. "I wasn't just an orphan," she had written. "I was a promise Father Donovan made to a woman he loved and abandoned." The priest flinched as if struck. "My mother was dying when she brought me to him, begging him to protect me. He turned us away, but she left me with his name, his history, and a warning. The same people who killed her would come for me too." A choked sound escaped Father Donovan's throat. The Greens stared at him, the pieces slotting into place with terrible clarity. This wasn't just guilt. This was a reckoning. The weight of Lila's words settled over the church like a shroud, pressing down on every soul present. Father Donovan's knees buckled, his hand grasping the edge of the altar for support as decades of carefully constructed lies crumbled around him. His breath came in ragged gasps, each one shuddering with the weight of confession. "She was mine," he whispered, the words tearing from him like a long-buried splinter finally pulled free. "Not by blood, but by oath. Her mother, Eleanor, was a woman I loved before I took my vows. When she came to me, sick and desperate, I turned her away. I was afraid of scandal, of losing everything I had built." His voice broke, the facade of the steadfast priest dissolving into the raw grief of a man who had betrayed his own heart. Mrs. Green's tears fell freely now, but her voice was steel. "And Lila? Did you know they would come for her?" The priest's silence was answer enough. He had known. He had always known. The letter trembled in her hands as she read the final lines, Lila's voice reaching beyond the grave. "They found me because he never hid me, because he was ashamed, but I forgive him, and I hope one day he can forgive himself." The words hung in the air, a bitter-sweet absolution that cut deeper than any accusation. Outside, the storm had quieted, leaving behind a world washed clean and trembling in the aftermath. Father Donovan lifted his head, his eyes meeting the casket where Lila lay, her face peaceful in eternal sleep. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to truly see her, not as a secret to be buried, but as a life to be honored. His voice, when it came, was barely audible, but it carried the weight of a man stepping out of shadows. "We will bury her," he said, "not in secrecy, but in light. And I will tell the congregation everything." The Greens exchanged a glance, the anger in their hearts tempered by something softer, understanding perhaps, or the quiet knowledge that some wounds never truly heal. But as the first rays of dawn spilled through the stained glass, painting Lila's casket in hues of gold and crimson, they knew this was not an ending, but a long overdue beginning. The morning of the funeral dawned with an eerie stillness, the kind that settles over a town holding its breath. Word had spread like wildfire through Blackwood. Father Donovan's confession, Lila's tragic connection to him, the sinister forces that had pursued her, the church, once half empty for the girl no one fully understood, now overflowed with people crammed into pews and lining the walls, their faces a mix of curiosity, guilt, and dawning horror at the role their silence might have played. The air was thick with the scent of lilies and damp wool, the occasional muffled sob cutting through the low murmur of voices. At the front, Lila's casket stood open for the first time, surrounded by photographs of her smiling. School portraits, candid shots with the Greens, images that painted the story of a life that had been bright and full of promise before it was stolen away. Father Donovan looked like a man who had aged decades overnight. His robes hung loosely on his frame, his hands trembling as he gripped the pulpit, his voice raw from hours of weeping. But when he spoke, there was a newfound strength in his words, a resolve that hadn't been there before. "We are here today not just to bury Lila," he began, "but to honor the truth she carried, a truth I tried to bury with my shame." He faltered then, his gaze flickering to the casket, and for a moment it seemed he might collapse under the weight of his remorse. But he continued, his voice gaining strength as he laid bare the sins of his past, the woman he had loved and abandoned, the child he had refused to acknowledge, the enemies he had unwittingly led to her doorstep. "I thought I was protecting myself," he admitted, "but all I did was deliver her to them." A ripple of shock passed through the crowd. Then from the back of the church, a man stood, tall, unfamiliar, his face grim. "You should have let her stay buried, Father," he said, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. The room froze. No one recognized him, but the way Father Donovan paled spoke volumes. This was no mourner. This was a reckoning. The stranger's voice seemed to slither through the church, coating the gathered mourners in a sudden, suffocating dread. His eyes never left Father Donovan's face as he took a slow step forward, his polished shoes clicking ominously against the stone floor. The priest's breath came in shallow gasps, his fingers turning bone white where they gripped the pulpit. "You," he whispered, the word barely audible, but carrying the weight of a lifetime of fear. The man smiled then, a cold, mirthless twist of lips that didn't reach his eyes, and the congregation instinctively shrank back, their earlier curiosity now replaced by primal unease. Lila's letter had spoken of shadows that followed her, of people who wanted her silenced, but seeing one of them standing boldly in God's house made the threat terrifyingly real. Mrs. Green moved instinctively toward the casket, as if to shield Lila even in death, while Mr. Green stepped forward, his farmer's hands curling into fists. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded, his voice echoing through the suddenly claustrophobic space. The stranger didn't bother to look at him. "A concerned party," he said smoothly, his gaze still locked on the priest. "Here to ensure certain inconvenient truths remain buried, starting with the girl." His meaning was clear. This wasn't just a threat. It was a desecration waiting to happen. The air grew thick with tension, the stained glass saints seeming to lean in as if bearing witness. Then from the choir loft, a voice rang out, clear, defiant, and achingly familiar to those who had known her. "You're too late." Every head snapped upward. There was no one there, but the words hung in the air like a challenge, and in that moment, the church's ancient bell began to toll on its own, a deep, resonant sound that shook the very foundations. The stranger's smug expression faltered. The candles flared unnaturally bright, their light catching the silver cross around Father Donovan's neck, the same cross Lila had always fiddled with during services when she was nervous. Whether it was a miracle or merely the collective will of a town finally choosing courage over fear, the effect was instant. The stranger stumbled back as the mourners rose as one, their earlier shock hardening into something fiercer. Miss Edna, frail but fiery, stepped into the aisle, her cane pointed like a weapon. "You don't get to rewrite her story," she spat. Father Donovan, tears streaming down his face, descended from the pulpit with sudden purpose. "Her truth is ours now," he said, his voice stronger than it had been in years. "And we will shout it." The stranger's confidence cracked. He backed toward the doors, but not before hissing one final threat. "This isn't over," before vanishing into the daylight. The bell ceased its tolling as suddenly as it had begun. In the heavy silence that followed, Father Donovan turned back to Lila's casket, his hand resting gently atop it. "Let's lay our girl to rest," he murmured. And this time, when he began the funeral rites, his voice didn't shake. The burial took place under a sky so blue it hurt to look at, the freshly turned earth smelling of rain and renewal. As the last hymn faded, a single white butterfly, Lila's favorite, alighted on the piled flowers before fluttering away. The town would talk of that day for generations, of secrets and redemption and the ghost of a girl who refused to be silenced. But for the Greens and Father Donovan, it was simpler than that. It was peace at last.
Subscribe and press the bell icon so that you never miss the amazing video.